as our expert here, did I misspeak? Are there some things you'd like to add to those elements of the science, the tools that will help guide the landscape evolution?
Sure, I can add a couple things. I think one of the main points that we're trying to emphasize is this landscape approach, and that I think the value that we can add with the science plan is to promote that we shouldn't just be looking at individual projects, and that we want to provide forums for people to come together and look at their projects together and work together on the bigger picture, so that they're not just doing their projects in isolation, and that they're also looking at this historical ecology and working from the same template, basically. The landscape scale conceptual model that's called for in the Delta Plan, that we called for in the Delta Science Plan, that we see as a key element of the restoration framework, we see that as kind of the unifying map that we would propose that the habitat restoration folks work together from that map. And that map also will incorporate feasibility assessment, it will incorporate landowner concerns, and that's all through this restoration network and restoration framework. So I think those are some key attributes. And that also the monitoring and the science and evaluation that's done can be shared. It really is the bigger picture that we're trying to promote, that we shouldn't just look at an individual project, but look at suites of projects, look where there are efficiencies and economies of scale for people to work together and gather that information working together.
Right, thanks. Reinhard, do you want to
add? Yeah, I'd like to add the context that Tracy mentioned earlier about how we can operationalize this within the constraints, especially with regard to permitting and the regulatory framework that exists, that where the science plan and the science program can add a ton of value is to work with the permitting agencies to make sure that the whole permit construct happens at the same scale that we're talking about restoring landscapes here. That we want to avoid parcel by parcel or project by project permitting and streamline, not streamline, but more make the permitting and the regulatory process much more informed by science, especially with this landscape context in mind. So where we can add value here is work and help inform the permitting process to make sure that the monitoring requirements that get issued for restoration projects and mitigation projects, that happens in a scientifically valid and also in an expeditious way.
Are there any questions?
How would you apply the example to the need to make decisions or to allocate money to be spent on the project?
Now it's your turn to have a blank stare.
Well,
I think in this particular example, the decision has already been made. Land has been acquired for restoration. It's identified as an area of potentially very high value to the ecosystem. And so really, the decision to go to a particular site will really be made at a level above this particular site. I think the questions are likely to be, as land is acquired, and there's only limited money to do restoration at a certain time, what is the sequence that you would actually invest dollars for restoration? And so part of that is a two-part decision. This is in the science plan. We have this idea of being able to bring together groups of people to articulate these alternative futures. And so part of that would be helping to prioritize, if there's 4 or 5 areas available right now, which is going to give the biggest potential benefit for the ecosystem in the shortest amount of time. And so there would be a screening process in order to make those decisions. But I know Dr. Collier is facing very similar things up in Puget Sound.
So on the science board, we put our things up like this, but these fall over too easily, so it's an inferior system. In another aspect, when you ask the question, how would money be spent, at least as I read the science plan and the need to have especially a more comprehensive and coordinated monitoring approaches, on some projects you may decide, we know we don't know enough about the effectiveness of this restoration action we're going to take. We're going to really monitor here. We're going to put a substantial portion of the money for this project into some assessment of the outcomes, the environmental outcomes of this project. Whereas other projects, you may decide we already know enough. We have enough ongoing monitoring. We'd really, as long as we all understand the scope of where we're monitoring and what environmental outcomes we're trying to get to, and we have some monitoring going on, we can then scale back on some of the monitoring. Right now, the way, again, my understanding, and I think it's probably pretty true down here as well as it is up in the Northwest, when you are going to undertake a major project with an uncertain outcome, the requirements for monitoring and assessment can be pretty onerous. But if we, in fact, regionally we have an agreement that we will assess these types of projects, but not everywhere all the
Okay,
time.
stop there. How would, no. I'm interested in that point. How would you get an agreement on evaluation and monitoring that involves multiple organizations or agencies?
I'll turn that one over to Lauren and Peter and Reiner. But I don't know enough about how I'm saying conceptually, if you have the type of monitoring approach that they're envisioning here and what we're trying to build in Puget Sound, you then have the trust built up to have the agreement that you don't have to do all
That's
this
okay. If you want to talk about an example of Puget Sound, go
So
ahead.
for us, it's stormwater. Stormwater is one of our big issues. So we have a stormwater monitoring group that's been working for 4 years now. And we are basically at the stage now where we can say, instead of having all these individual dischargers monitoring their discharges, doing a lot of monitoring that is regulatorily required but is actually not informing, let's instead agree to scale back some of that monitoring, put more emphasis, pool some funds, put more emphasis on some of these questions we don't get to by these individual small-scale project monitoring. So we are scaling it. Ideally we're scaling our monitoring based on the uncertainty around
Who's
the problem.
the we? Who's the convener or the authority?
It's an agreement. It's a stormwater monitoring work group. I sat on it when it started 3 years ago. It was about 60 people. It's federal, state, municipalities, NGOs, tribes are all involved, and it's been a long process of herding a lot of cats. But people.
What increases the level of cooperation?
Communication. I mean, it really is the communication and the recognition of the problems that we're facing and the fact that we're not getting answers with our current approach.
And how does science inform that, if it does?
Science informs that primarily by saying this level of uncertainty requires a larger scale approach to monitoring and to experimentation. That we will not get science answers based on the current approaches that we have established under statute.
Do you get any who said, well, we're going to go our own way because we know better, or we're not really contributing much to the problem, or
There's been some of that, but largely I think that because we have the Puget Sound Partnership, which has the statutory responsibility of coordinating, we continue, and we're giving the lead on some of this to the State Department of Ecology, and they've assigned staff to it because it's critical for them and their resources. So we are coordinating, but State Department of Ecology is actually taking a lot of the leadership in this area.
So, Lauren, do you see an analogy here to what we're working on?
Sure. Well, there are the different steps in the process, too. So Reiner might want to talk more about the monitoring side of it. What I'm kind of been thinking more about, so I don't know if we want to go to Reiner and then talk about it. What I'm talking more about is not just the monitoring that's being done, but how to make the decisions about what areas to restore and how to do the restoration designs so that they fit well together within each of the priority restoration areas. And that's what those landscape scale conceptual models that we're talking about are all about. And I have
I'm most curious about the first part of what you said, which is how the decisions are made.
Well, here's, I think, the approach that we're promoting, and we'll see how well that works. But what we've been doing is working through the Restoration Network, which is sponsored by the Delta Conservancy, under Campbell Ingram. And so hopefully many of you have heard of that Restoration Network. They've been meeting for a while. I've attended several of the meetings. I think people are seeing value in just coordinating restoration efforts together already. We're getting the right level of people attending, the key groups that are doing planning and implementing restoration right now.
Are there any outliers, major outliers that ought to be part of that?
I think there are some other folks that should be there that aren't there. And Mike could be.
So does Greg come, for instance?
Well, I have a feeling Greg would say he shouldn't be coming because Byron Buck is there, and Byron Buck is the person to be there. Right. And that's the kind of level person that's there. Laura King Moon comes. Carl Wilcox comes. That's the level of people coming to these meetings because I think they see value in getting together and working together. So we want to work, and they see the value, I think, of the science informing what they're doing. And so we're partnering with the Conservancy and with that Restoration Network group to develop this restoration framework that talks about let's work together to develop this map, this template, this big picture scheme of what would make sense for restoring for each of the 6 priority restoration areas. And then as best as possible, as lands are already owned or are acquired, people work together so that on that diagram, for example, McCormick-Williamson Tract is a subset of what you're seeing there. The lower left-hand corner is Dead Horse Island, and I actually don't know some of the names of the other properties. But you can see that you're getting a very different design. If you restored McCormick-Williamson Tract in and of itself within those property boundaries, that's the design on the top. The designs on the bottom mean if you had the opportunity to get the adjacent properties, your design looks different. You're working more with nature. And because of that, we think you're going to have a higher likelihood of success in achieving the ecosystem functions you're looking for.
So as you work that up and the council's implementation committee meets and convenes, is that something, for instance, that you would report to the implementation committee and then the council, in effect, would know how you're doing and who's cooperative and if anybody is less cooperative?
Yeah, I think that's the vision, is that what we're hoping is that this restoration network sponsored by the Conservancy becomes the habitat restoration work group associated with the Interagency Implementation Committee. So exactly what you just said. And we are trying to partner with them with the science part of it and work through that same venue to ensure science-based decisions and cooperation.
And much of the motivation for that is provided through the permitting agencies, in this case, California Fish and Wildlife, U.S. EPA, the regional boards, State Water Board, Army Corps, that all have a seat at the table. And they're really the ones that sort of create the impetus for these networks to function. That's really the motivating factor behind it. Section 402.
Right. So they're part of the authority or the reason for doing that. But also, they at times could create barriers or problems. So, if you're stripping all the levees of vegetation, that could be a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's why you want to have them in at the very beginning, and the beautiful example that we have right now is that SAC Regional is now actually becoming involved in planning for these different scenarios with their own scientific expertise, participating at the table and becoming involved as a party that has traditionally not necessarily had habitat restoration on their minds, but needs to follow or creatively address Clean Water Act requirements that work hand in hand with restoration objectives. And that's the value of this, really, that's already manifest right now on One Delta, One Science.
Yeah.
I want to follow up on Patrick's comments. The methodology, for lack of a better word, that you're explaining on all of this is very interesting to me. But it's based at a time and place where disparate agencies are called upon, demanded, and willing to talk collaboratively. But the system you're trying to develop is one that also shapes the discussion when that interest disappears or becomes, ordinary and meaningless. And you want a methodology of approach that even as, an individual, McCormick Williamson, the Nature Conservancy, another NGO pops up with 2,000 acres, and all they care about is their 2,000 acres, and let's move with that. And you want to place it in the context of a more comprehensive and understandable plan. And that's what that to me is the most interesting thing. Of course, my experience in public life has been that almost all significant land use decisions, not all, but almost all, are generated by individual property owners or interested parties who want to have a particular smaller thing done, and then agencies struggle with how to adjust to it. So for me, I look at it and say, well, we took the work from the Department of Fish and Wildlife on their areas of priority potential in and around the Delta and the Suisun Marsh, and that eventually became, with modification and adjustments, and after all these hearings, the 6 areas we designated in the Delta Plan as of potential significance, both for restoration, but also for actions for water supply reliability and the possibility of getting more efficient flood protection. So a nice combination. Mm-hmm. To me, the thing that the science plan could actually achieve and the science program, Delta Science program, could promote is what doesn't happen mostly in a political context, which is people looking beyond the boundaries of a particular ownership pattern. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the messages of this chart. But for me, it's always the step back, get Randy to fly in his airplane and take a bigger photograph of an area where you see, over on the left is the South Yolo project, and then there's Liberty Island, and then there's McCormick Williamson, and oops, Dead Horse is down here, and oh, by the way, I guess the last one includes the meadows, or it reaches toward the Consumnes River
Delta
Preserve.
Mm-hmm.
Now that is the approach that we are statutorily directed to promote in the Delta Plan, the interconnected habitats. But it's that broad view, which is not a mandatory broad view, but it's just a way of looking at something designed to get the greatest potential benefit either for water reliability, flood protection, or restoration out of these various actions. I think that's a very valuable piece of contextual information that will not survive the current interest BDCP generated or whatever else automatically, because it's too easy to fall back into the old patterns, different organizations, different priorities, and all that. One of the things that is encouraging about this discussion is that it's based in law. It's not, and it allows planners to just simply say to the multiple agencies interested, God, interesting idea. Here are the linkages and potentials that might exist. Now, I think that's an extraordinarily valuable scientific service to the community. I understand for a project applicant who only wants to do one thing at the cheapest cost in the shortest period of time, that's not helpful to be told that there is greater potential. But in this interconnected Delta and Suisun Marsh territory, that kind of discussion is inevitable. The thing that interested me, of course, is that even here on these charts, and these were from the estuary report directly, right?
Correct.
All 4 of them, I think, or 5 of them. They merged islands, and they did that, that's just the way you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's okay, but that is a big intellectual and procedural jump, and you can't assume it. So dead horses, it's there, and I got all the arguments why it ought to be done. I mean, it's just, Patrick's raised the right question. It's when involved, what to say, is it a contextual discussion? Now that, to me, is the area where there's the greatest possibility of scientific collaboration, cooperation, coordination, something like that. Because we have a lot of publicly owned lands involved, we have targets that are well known, have been promoted one way or another for years, and it's just a matter of sorting out the priorities. I don't know where I'm going with this, but I mean the potential's there. But it's not. Yeah. You need to build a system that will survive 25 years from now when there is not the interest.
Right.
And that, to me, is really important.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we recognize that, and so we're trying to take this opportunity now to build these tools. We see these landscape scale conceptual models, or sometimes they're called conservation strategies, as tools. And just like the ecosystem restoration program, they already developed their conservation strategy that the Delta Plan and the Delta Stewardship Council then used in a policy, in a regulation. If we can develop tools today, they're then available to be used by policymakers and regulators tomorrow, or say for the next version of the Delta Plan even. So you all can think about how you might want to utilize these tools and maybe help set in stone something that makes them, live beyond this moment of cooperation.
Don.
Yeah, if I could, I think Chris may want to weigh in too. I just wanted to say that it occurs to me that if you're looking at the long term, that part of to look at science, and I know that Peter mentioned certainly social science, but agricultural science, because if you're looking at, obviously you have some lands that are held by conservancies now, but you have others that are held in private ownership. And looking at not only agricultural displacement, but one of the things that I think has been at least a good part of the success, certainly of what NTC has done further to the east, is they've worked with landowners. You still allow folks, on the farmscape to have a home there, to have farming-related activities. In a lot of cases, it's farm-friendly types of practice. I mean, wildlife-friendly practices, farming. Some of these areas may be lower elevation, so they're not going to would no longer be farmed. But that's a critical piece when you talk about long-term strategies and working with, certainly those who may have an interest because they already have the lands or have an obligation to conserve or restore habitat or create habitat. And I think that would serve everybody well. Again, they may not be the scientists, may not be the agency representatives, but there are some I think very fine examples out there, certainly not just in this area of McCormick-Williamson, it happens to be in Sacramento County, but throughout the Delta and the Suisun Marsh, where you have compatible activities, and that if over time, using the point about the evolving place, that to recognize the impacts, but also how the impacts are mitigated or minimized, but how that gets integrated to the long-range outlook, to what Phil and I think Patrick and others were talking about. If in fact this is where you're headed, 100 years from now, how is it that with what you want to do with the environment and the species and all the critters, how do people fit into that equation beyond those who are going to manage and monitor and assure that certain things get done? Because I think that's a critical piece of having folks that appreciate, understand, and are a part of the day-to-day activities as things evolve. And so I know it's not lost to any of you, but as I look at these 5 pictures here and kind of recognize the landscape in my own mind, yeah, there's some things that could happen here, but it's not going to require cooperation and agreement, but also then where do people fit into this picture and some of the activities and flood protection and how that's impacted you'll account for those things. But I just would offer that as a kind of a perspective that could fit in nicely with all the other challenges that are involved in trying to do something of this scale. So.
Well, and that's one of the reasons we like working with the restoration network at the Delta Conservancy, because they're doing a good job of trying to get that participation. And that's an area where I do think we need more participation from the locals, because these landscape scale conceptual models, they need to take everything into account. They're not just, habitat only and don't think about anything else. It really is where on the landscape, what are the existing uses and what makes sense. What are the feasibility constraints, plus or minus, for whatever your priorities are? You can use these models and you can optimize the different aspects, agriculture of different types, and you can do this future modeling that Peter talks about all the time too. Taking into consideration sea level rise and other changes. What would the landscape look like? What's going to work for the people that are there now and the future that's going to change?
Mr. Knob?
I just wanted to say how appreciative I am for the rapid evolution of thought of this science plan. From its early beginnings to where we are now, it's just made fantastic progress. And the adaptive management portion I knew was important at the beginning, and now I think I'm finding myself continually in awe of how complicated it is and how central to our ability to achieve the co-equal goals adaptive management is. And today's discussion earlier, when we were talking with Carl and Carla, was another reinforcement of that simple point that is hard to really grok the importance of this program, and a program that I think the science community acknowledges is a very difficult one to implement. I think Carl Walters, in his description of this, made some comment that 100 examples, none had really passed the test. And yet we are relying on this to be successful. Failure is not an option because we are building our success on this program. And some of the things that strike me as just the big picture pieces of a successful program are the ability to coordinate goals among the different agencies, the ability to coordinate our actions relative to those goals. And we had that discussion about the biological opinions, the court-ordered adaptive management there. The State Water Resources Board, we didn't mention them today, but they have an adaptive program for water quality. BDCP has an adaptive program to determine flow levels into the delta. Well, that's the whole enchilada. That's what we're talking about here, is all those pieces all relying on adaptive management. And then for that to work, we have to have the ability to have a timely ability to experiment. And Reiner, you alluded to science, I think, providing some assistance there by providing good information to the regulatory agencies. I'd love to follow that up with you later, but it's a little off track at this point. But, it really is the question of that permitting being able to occur in a timely way. And then the timely analysis, which I think we've made a lot of progress on, the synthesis of that data, and then the timely exchange from synthesized information into policy. And I think, again, the science plan has made good strides in those two areas. But the thing that still leaves me hanging is the common goals, the coordination, and the timely ability to experiment. Is that high on your radar, or am I just making stuff up here?
It certainly is high on our radar, yeah. Science is there to give you guys the courage to jump. Any manager and every landowner that needs to make decisions about what they want to do with their land, or how they want to permit certain things, or how to manage restoration projects, water management projects. Science can give them all the courage to jump off the cliff and hopefully in a soft landing.
Mr. Fiorini.
I want to follow up on that, Reiner, but I I just want to go on record as saying I want to see the science plan adopted and adopted soon. You've gotten good input from the Independent Science Board. It needs to be incorporated into the next draft, but I think you're getting close enough to where it's good enough to go, and we ought not to let the pursuit of perfect prevent us from getting something good on the street to try out. I'm a little conflicted as I look at the application of the Delta Science Plan. Rainer, when you talk about helping people to jump and plan, I think, okay, great. We've got 6 habitat restoration areas we've identified. We've got a state that's spending millions and millions and millions of dollars in the Delta to improve and maintain levees. Will the science plan help us identify what levees we ought not to be spending money on? Because ultimately, if we're improving levees on lands that we're going to purchase for habitat, the state is creating a higher value land that it's simply going to have to buy back after it's invested money to make it of higher value than to spend more money on habitat restoration. So on the big picture, will the science plan help us to determine early on what areas we ought not to be spending money on levees, and that will be? And then on the other end of it, I think, well, golly, that's a pretty big. It would be something pretty big to achieve to come up with something like that. How about a McCormick Williamson? How about just one project? How is the application of the science plan going to speed that up and give us new knowledge that will then lead us to either applying that in other areas in the Delta, or saying, wait a minute, this didn't work. This didn't achieve what we thought it was going to achieve. Now what do we do? So where are we going to be at in 5 years if a Delta science plan that's similar to what we're currently looking at today, where are we going to be at in 5 years with that after that's implemented and active?
Well, let me try and tackle that initially, and then Peter and Lauren may want to weigh in on this, and maybe Tracy too. And that is, I think the adaptive management is essentially sort of the holy grail, right? Or it sounds like it right now, because we haven't truly found the perfect example where it worked all the way through the whole cycle and then over again. It's really the infrastructure that's underpinning the adaptive management concept, meaning how do we design monitoring program? How do we make an efficient data management system available to everyone so we can share the data and exchange them and synthesize stuff? And I think we can't look at adaptive management in isolation from the underpinnings that create the foundation of actually applying adaptive management principles. So I think we're working on that just as consciously and diligently as at actually making the adaptive management concept operational. And it's not just at the McCormick Williamson tract, it's at Yolo Ranch, it's at Prospect Island, the whole Cache Slough area. We're thinking about this with our partners in several of these priority restoration areas. So I'm not sure if that gets at your question, but I think we're, I just want to highlight that it's not just the activities that we're doing now on adaptive management, it's the underpinnings that really need to support it. So maybe Lauren can help with it.
Yeah.
Do you want to go on?
Well, okay. Well, specifically the levy question, there is an existing conservation strategy that of course, Chris Enright was involved in, and Stuart Siegel for Sassoon Marsh. And it's GIS-based. So it's a tool. So they can look at scenarios, including what-if scenarios. So this piece of property is in conservation ownership right here, and this one over here. And let's look at what it would take if we just restored those two individually, and we would have to reinforce the levees around those to protect the adjacent properties. But if we could just get the property in the middle too, now we have, a bigger levee to reinforce. So there's just efficiencies there, and you can look at that, and that's one of the things that's in that particular model, is they've got a tool to look at that exact question from a habitat area perspective, because that was the focus of it. But so I think it gets a little bit at what you're saying. So in other words, there are certain levees you would not want to spend money on reinforcing if in between those, if you had a sense that that property would be available relatively soon, whatever that means. So that would help you make decisions from that perspective. So I think the tool can also be used in other ways, again, depending, just like I was saying before, if you're also looking at what areas should be protected for agriculture and how do the levees need to be configured for them. What about urban areas? So I think it's a tool that probably could be applied for other purposes. So hopefully we can advance those kinds of conversations around developing these tools for multiple purposes.
Well, that's a good example of what I've been asking for, application of science.
Exactly.
There were $30 million that DWR just awarded to levees in the Delta. Do you know if this system, this approach was considered when they determined where the $30 million would be spent?
I actually don't know. I'm not familiar with the process.
I'm not sure. Perhaps I could just build on what Lauren and Rainer said. I think what we're dealing here, we're blurring the science and the decision. And this is, when you look at the Policy Science Forum, the role of the implementation committee and how that feeds down to science and the information that you get back. So the question that you would ask is, science community, do you have a model that can tell me risk of flooding? I want to know which of the restoration areas where we're really going to get the biggest benefit, so that we should be targeting those areas. That's already been done in the restoration areas. Then through the grand challenges, we then have the science steering committee, we have this open process to develop the specific science questions that we can come back, so there would be a body available to make those decisions. Because as you pointed out in many meetings, there's certain islands with heavy infrastructure, massive investment, other reasons going on, that it might be great for habitat restoration, but there's other values that would mean that wouldn't make sense. So I think this is the beauty of the Policy Science Forum, is being able to pose those questions, come back to the science community, ensure that we're then feeding you with the information with the tools that's defensible, and as SFEI are very good at, they say it needs to be packaged. You need to be able to take that information so it's instantly understandable, which is the communication side. So I think what we're doing here is we're, at the science plan, we're wanting to make sure, how do we structure the science community in order to be responsive to those kinds of questions, get you the kind of information where these really, some of them really tough societal decisions can be made. So it's not a question of dueling scientists out there, but it's a question of social values, of what's more important than another.
That's a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Okay, Don? All right. Just before we wrap it up, I know some people want to talk. I just want to make a note. I agree with Randy and Pat. The science board comment should be incorporated. You've given an indication you're doing that. I like the fact that they pointed out that of the 28 action items, I mean, some of them really are not as important as others, but they are mechanical things that the Delta Science Program is already doing or could easily do. Don't offer any particular problems, and by itemizing those things as subsets, you strengthen the attention given to the other actions that you're recommending that do require concurrence of others. And I haven't gone through the list in detail, but let me just give you a couple of examples of the things that to me seem well within our jurisdiction and shouldn't require any particular thing. Action recommendation 2.6 is publish and update the state of Bay Delta science. Well, the science program did it in 2008, and everybody liked it, and we've talked for 3 years about doing it again, and that seems to me part of the mission of the Delta Science Program, which is to provide information, to provide the best available scientific information at a given moment in time, and to just get it out there for information purposes. Ditto on the idea of an annual State of the Delta Science address by the Delta lead scientist. I mean, the title is an important title, and it implies things like that. I mean, that's not the kind of thing that you ought to have 2 years of interagency meetings before you do, it seems to me. Performance measures, 2.8, we're required by statute to do performance measures. As a matter of fact, you guys are coming closer to anybody else to doing this with the little four-colored dots on this monthly chart you do. I mean, that could be helpful. I don't, it's an important issue, but we are statutorily required to do it, and so on. Also, the notion of having an adaptive management forum, I mean, that's identical to what you already do on conferences and meetings and consultation and brown bag lunches I mean, that's the stuff that's going on. Even the adaptive management liaison, I mean, that's implicit in what's going on, where the statute told us to encourage advanced consultation on potential covered actions and try to cooperate as best we can. Anyway, I think systematically going through a list of 28 would allow you to separate out those things which are I would suggest of less controversy, and then concentrate and organize and structure what remains in a manner that reflects the science board, some of the science board suggestions. That to me would be very helpful, Peter.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
This is in the nature of technical stuff, and I think I mentioned it last month, but in the second draft, unless I missed it completely, in the appendix on independent science review process, the reference that was in the first draft to panels, participants on an independent review panel not having a conflict of interest has been dropped. Now, maybe I missed the language. I may have. But it seems to me that's our existing policy. It's what the science program's been doing anyway. It didn't go into great detail, but it flags a very important issue on review. And so maybe I'm just wrong. I missed it. Then I don't know what you're going to do about this, but on page 5 of the executive summary, in language that's somewhat different from the text of the science report, you say, we're going to do independent peer-reviewed objective science products to inform decisions, but expressly will not pass value judgment on the trade-offs among different decisions. I just put the note, and a bunch of question marks after that. It does not explain itself. I understand you are not urging, and I am not urging you, to impose an imperial regime with dictatorial orders on anyone. But I just didn't understand the phrase. That's all. Okay, that's me. Anyone else? All right, ladies, do we have some comments?